The strange thing about regret is that it never arrives when you expect it. It waits until the moment you finally understand what you lost. Daniel Carter stared at the glossy magazine resting on the small round table beside his untouched coffee, the morning sunlight slipping through the cafe window and catching the silver letters printed across the cover. And there she was, Eleanor Hayes, calm eyes, effortless smile, dressed in a tailored ivory suit that looked simple until you noticed the confidence it carried. The headline reading America's quietest billionaire heiress, and for a long moment he did not breathe because the woman on that cover was not just someone famous or distant or unreal. She was the woman who used to stand barefoot in their kitchen on Sunday mornings measuring pancake batter with a chipped blue cup, the woman who once laughed when his business ideas were still scribbles on napkins, the woman he had walked away from without looking back, and the cafe noise faded into a dull hum as memories pressed in quietly, the scrape of chairs, the smell of roasted coffee beans, the low murmur of strangers who had no idea a man's past was unraveling in real time 2 feet from them. He picked up the magazine with careful fingers as if it might disappear, rereading the name again and again, Eleanor Hayes, as though repetition could make sense of the impossible transformation, because the Eleanor he remembered wore thrift store sweaters and drove a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard. The Eleanor he left behind apologized too much and made herself smaller so he could feel larger. And yet the article spoke of private investment empires, philanthropic foundations across 3 states, and a family legacy older than most corporations, words that felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, a stranger wrapped in success he could not comprehend, and Daniel felt a slow tightening in his chest not from jealousy but from recognition, the painful realization that nothing about her rise looked sudden, nothing about it looked accidental, it looked inevitable, as if she had always been destined for this version of herself and he had simply never bothered to see it. Outside a delivery truck rumbled past and sunlight shifted across the table, illuminating his reflection faintly in the cafe window. Older now, success respectable but ordinary, life predictable, safe and suddenly smaller than he remembered choosing. He thought back to the day he left, how certain he had been, how clean the decision felt, convincing himself he needed excitement, ambition, someone who matched the future he imagined. He remembered Eleanor standing quietly near the doorway, hands clasped, not begging, not angry, just watching him with an expression he had mistaken for weakness when in truth it had been acceptance. And now the memory returned differently, heavier, sharper, because that silence had not been defeat, it had been release. She had not chased him, had not argued, had simply stepped aside as though allowing destiny to rearrange itself without resistance. And Daniel realized with a sudden clarity that unsettled him more than any argument ever could that the story he told himself for years, that he had outgrown her, was wrong. He had walked away before she ever revealed who she truly was, before she stepped into the power waiting quietly beneath her patience. And as the cafe door opened letting in a cool morning breeze, the pages of the magazine fluttered softly beneath his hand, revealing another photograph of Eleanor standing at a charity gala, poised among world leaders and investors, her smile reserved, composed, untouchable, and Daniel felt something he had never experienced during their marriage. Something deeper than nostalgia and heavier than loss, the unmistakable weight of understanding arriving too late, because success had not changed her into someone new. It had simply uncovered the woman he failed to recognize when she belonged to him, and in that ordinary American morning, surrounded by strangers and unfinished coffee, Daniel Carter finally understood that the greatest mistake of his life had not been choosing another path. It had been leaving before he learned the true value of the woman quietly building a future beside him. Daniel did not remember finishing his coffee that morning, only the sound of porcelain touching the table and the strange weight in his chest that followed him all the way to his car, because once recognition begins it refuses to stop, and as he sat behind the steering wheel staring at the quiet street outside the cafe, memories returned with uncomfortable clarity, not dramatic moments or loud arguments but small ordinary scenes he once dismissed. Eleanor sitting at the dining table late at night surrounded by documents he never bothered to read, financial reports spread neatly beside a yellow legal pad, her glasses slipping slightly down her nose while she calculated something with calm concentration, and he remembered asking why she worked so hard when his career was already taking off, remembered how she smiled gently and said she liked understanding how money moved because stability mattered more than attention, and at the time he laughed, calling her cautious, telling friends she lacked ambition, never realizing that discipline was her ambition, that patience was her strategy, and now Those quiet evenings felt different in hindsight, as if he had watched the foundation of an empire being built without recognizing it. The past unfolded further, leading him back to the final months of their marriage when his world grew louder while hers grew quieter. Networking events, new colleagues, invitations that made him feel important, people who praised his confidence and encouraged him to think bigger, faster, bolder. And somewhere along that rise he began seeing Eleanor as part of an earlier version of himself, someone connected to struggle rather than success. He convinced himself she held him back simply because she did not compete for attention, and he remembered the night he told her he wanted something different, how the apartment felt unusually still, rain tapping lightly against the windows, Eleanor standing near the kitchen counter listening without interruption, no accusations, no emotional display, only a long breath before she nodded slowly as though she had already sensed this ending approaching. She asked only one question, whether he was certain, and when he said yes she accepted his answer with grace that unsettled him more than anger ever could, because she did not try to change his mind, she simply wished him happiness, a response he interpreted as indifference instead of strength. He packed a single suitcase believing he was stepping into a brighter future, unaware he was leaving behind a woman who had already begun stepping into her own. After the divorce, Daniel moved quickly into a life that looked successful from the outside. Promotions, travel, polished dinners filled with conversation about growth and opportunity. Yet over time those achievements blended together without depth, while Eleanor disappeared entirely from his world. No social media presence, no shared friends mentioning her name, just absence, and he assumed absence meant failure. Assumed she had faded into anonymity the way people sometimes do after heartbreak, never imagining she had withdrawn intentionally, choosing privacy over validation, learning, building, inheriting responsibilities she had never spoken about during their marriage because she never needed recognition to feel secure. And now sitting alone in his car years later with the magazine resting on the passenger seat, Daniel understood the most painful truth of all. Eleanor had not changed after he left. She had simply stopped minimizing herself for someone who could not see her clearly, and the realization settled over him like late afternoon sunlight, quiet but irreversible, because regret does not arrive as a sudden storm, it arrives as understanding, slow and undeniable, revealing that the moment he believed he was moving forward had actually been the moment he walked away from the most extraordinary future he would ever stand close enough to touch. The invitation arrived 3 days later, embossed cream paper delivered to his office reception with understated elegance that immediately set it apart from the usual corporate mail. And Daniel recognized the name before he even finished opening the envelope. Hayes Foundation Annual Investment Gala, Manhattan, black tie. And for several seconds he simply stared at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less personal, less deliberate. Because this was not a random charity event or distant business gathering, this was her world. A world he now realized had existed long before him, and curiosity mixed with something deeper pulled him there despite the quiet voice telling him he did not belong. The evening of the gala arrived cold and clear, city lights reflecting off glass towers while black cars lined the entrance, cameras flashing softly as guests stepped onto the carpet with practiced confidence. Daniel adjusted his suit jacket and walked inside feeling strangely aware of every movement, every conversation. The space filled with low music, crystal chandeliers casting warm light across polished marble floors, investors, philanthropists, and executives speaking in calm measured tones that carried the ease of true influence rather than ambition. And then the room shifted almost imperceptibly as attention moved toward the entrance behind him, conversations lowering not out of excitement but respect. And when Daniel turned he saw her, Eleanor Hayes, walked in without announcement, wearing a midnight blue gown that reflected light like quiet water, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, greeting people with gentle familiarity rather than performance. And what struck him most was not wealth or glamour but certainty. She moved like someone entirely at peace with her place in the world. Staff members greeted her by name, board members leaned in attentively when she spoke, and the realization settled heavily that she was not attending this event as a guest. She was its center. Moments later a speaker approached the stage and welcomed the audience before inviting Eleanor forward, describing her leadership, her strategic vision, her commitment to long-term investment in communities across the country. Words that painted a picture Daniel had never imagined while they were married, and as applause filled the room he felt both proud and painfully distant, watching the woman he once shared ordinary mornings with stand confidently before hundreds of influential guests. Eleanor spoke briefly, her voice calm and sincere, thanking collaborators and emphasizing responsibility over recognition, never mentioning personal success, never seeking admiration. And Daniel understood then that her power came not from wealth alone, but from clarity. She had grown into herself without needing anyone's approval. After the presentation, guests gathered around her offering congratulations, and for a moment their eyes met across the room, recognition passing between them quietly, no shock, no hesitation, just acknowledgement. She approached with the same gentle composure he remembered, greeting him warmly, asking how he had been as if years had softened every sharp edge. Her tone kind but distant in a way that confirmed what time had changed. They spoke briefly about work and life, the conversation polite, respectful, free of accusation or nostalgia, and Daniel realized she held no anger toward him, which somehow made the distance feel greater, because forgiveness meant she had already moved beyond the past that still defined him. A colleague called her name and she excused herself with a small smile before rejoining the crowd, leaving Daniel standing alone among strangers, understanding with painful clarity that he had not lost her to another person or circumstance, he had lost her to her own becoming. And as the evening continued around him filled with laughter, music, and quiet celebration, Daniel Carter finally accepted that regret does not change history. It only teaches the value of what was once freely given and never fully understood until it was gone. Daniel remained at the gala long after their brief conversation ended, standing near the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline while city lights stretched endlessly beneath him like a constellation brought down to earth. And although the room was filled with conversation and music, he felt strangely separate from it all, observing rather than belonging, because every detail he noticed now carried new meaning. The way Eleanor listened carefully when others spoke, how she remembered names, how people waited patiently for her attention not out of obligation but genuine respect, and he began to recognize something he had completely misunderstood during their marriage. She had never needed to prove her worth loudly because she had always understood it quietly. Memories continued to rearrange themselves in his mind, moments that once felt ordinary now revealing depth he had overlooked, evenings when she chose calm routines over crowded social events, weekends she spent reviewing reports while he chased opportunities that promised quick recognition. He once believed ambition looked like motion and noise, yet watching her now he saw ambition expressed through patience and long vision, the kind that grows slowly but lasts. And as servers moved through the room offering drinks and guests laughed softly around him, Daniel realized he had mistaken stillness for lack of drive, kindness for passivity, loyalty for limitation. The gala continued with speeches and announcements celebrating new initiatives funded through the Hayes Foundation, investments supporting education programs, community housing developments, and technology research designed to create sustainable growth, each project reflecting careful planning rather than impulsive success. And Daniel felt a quiet admiration mixed with an ache he could not ignore because he remembered how often Eleanor spoke about stability, about building something meaningful rather than impressive. Ideas he dismissed at the time as cautious thinking, now revealed as wisdom far ahead of him. Later in the evening he stepped onto a balcony seeking fresh air, the cool breeze carrying the distant sound of traffic below. And for the first time since seeing her again, he allowed himself to confront a truth he had avoided. He had not only underestimated her, he had underestimated the life they might have built together if he had possessed the patience to grow alongside her. Footsteps approached softly behind him and Eleanor joined him on the balcony, her presence calm and unforced, the city lights reflecting gently in her eyes as she asked whether he was enjoying the evening. And Daniel answered honestly that he was still trying to understand everything. She smiled slightly, not with superiority but compassion, explaining that life had simply taken them in different directions, that she learned after their separation that sometimes loss creates clarity. Her words carried no accusation, only acceptance shaped by time, and Daniel realized she was not standing before him as someone seeking validation from his regret. She no longer needed his recognition to feel complete. The conversation drifted toward simple memories, shared laughter about small things from years ago. Yet beneath the warmth lay an unmistakable boundary, the past. Acknowledged but not reopened. When another guest called her name, she excused herself once more, leaving Daniel alone with the skyline and the understanding settling deeper within him, that success does not erase history but it does redefine its meaning. And as he watched Eleanor re-enter the crowded ballroom greeted with admiration and trust, he finally understood that the greatest transformation had not been her rise to wealth or influence. It had been her quiet decision to become fully herself without waiting for anyone else to recognize her value. While he stood there realizing that sometimes the person you once believed you outgrew becomes the standard by which you measure every future choice, and the realization arrived gently but firmly, like the city lights glowing steady through the night, impossible to ignore and impossible to change. The gala slowly faded into evening as guests began leaving in quiet waves, conversations softening into polite goodbyes while staff cleared glasses and dimmed the lights just enough to signal closure without urgency, and Daniel lingered near the exit longer than necessary, watching Eleanor move effortlessly between final conversations, her presence calm yet unmistakably central to everything around her, and he realized he was witnessing a version of her life that no longer intersected with his own except through memory. Outside the building, the cool New York air carried the distant hum of taxis and late-night traffic, and when Eleanor finally stepped out onto the sidewalk surrounded briefly by assistants and colleagues discussing schedules and upcoming meetings, Daniel hesitated before approaching, uncertain whether he had the right to ask for more of her time, yet something within him needed to speak honestly at least once. She noticed him immediately and dismissed the others with a small nod, turning toward him with that same composed kindness that had always defined her. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable rather than strained. Daniel admitted quietly that seeing her again had changed how he remembered the past, that he finally understood how much he failed to see when they were together, his voice steady but sincere, not asking for forgiveness, not trying to reopen old doors, simply acknowledging truth. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful as city lights reflected softly across the pavement, and when she responded her words were gentle yet clear. She said that people grow at different speeds and sometimes love exists during a chapter rather than a lifetime, explaining that their marriage had been real and meaningful but it belonged to who they were then, not who they had become. She told him she held no resentment because leaving forced both of them to discover themselves honestly, and Daniel felt the weight of her acceptance settle into something peaceful rather than painful. He realized she was not standing before him as someone he lost to wealth or success but as someone who had completed a journey inward, becoming whole without needing validation from anyone else. A black car pulled to the curb and the driver stepped out quietly, holding the door open while Eleanor prepared to leave. Before getting in, she turned back toward Daniel and thanked him for the years they shared, saying those memories helped shape the strength she carries today. Her words sincere but final, and Daniel understood that closure does not arrive through dramatic endings, but through calm understanding. As the car pulled away, he watched its taillights disappear into the city, feeling neither anger nor longing, only clarity, because for the first time he accepted that regret is not punishment but education. It teaches the cost of taking quiet devotion for granted and the value of recognizing greatness before it walks away. He stood there on the sidewalk long after the street returned to normal rhythm, reflecting on how life rarely offers second chances with the same people, only opportunities to become better versions of ourselves moving forward. And as Daniel finally turned toward his own car, he carried with him a new awareness that success without appreciation feels incomplete, while Eleanor drove into a future she built through patience, resilience, and self-respect, leaving behind not a story of revenge but a quiet victory defined by dignity, growth, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the greatest realization comes long after the moment that changed everything. In the weeks that followed the gala, Daniel found himself moving through life differently, as though a quiet lens had shifted inside him, changing how he noticed ordinary moments that once passed without meaning. Mornings felt slower, conversations more deliberate, and success no longer carried the same excitement it once did because comparison had entered his thoughts not as jealousy but reflection. He began waking earlier than usual, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee growing cold while sunlight moved across the floor, remembering how Eleanor used to enjoy quiet mornings long before the world demanded attention, how she believed the first hour of the day determined the tone of everything that followed, and he realized he had spent years rushing toward outcomes while she invested in process, a difference he never appreciated until now. At work, colleagues congratulated him on recent achievements, yet their praise sounded distant, almost rehearsed, and Daniel noticed how often conversations revolved around appearances rather than substance, deals measured by visibility rather than lasting impact. And for the first time he questioned whether he had been chasing recognition instead of purpose. He began researching the Heiress Foundation not out of obsession but curiosity, reading about projects that focused on long-term community growth, education programs designed to support students over decades, renewable initiatives planned with patience rather than urgency, and each article revealed Eleanor's philosophy woven quietly into every decision: responsibility before prestige, sustainability before applause, values she once spoke about in their living room while he checked emails distractedly. Understanding arrived gradually that she had never needed transformation after their separation because her direction had always been clear. It was he who needed time to recognize depth beyond immediate success. One afternoon Daniel attended a small charity luncheon connected to his company, an event he might previously have skipped, and he found himself listening more carefully to people's stories, asking questions without trying to impress anyone, discovering a sense of fulfillment in genuine connection rather than performance. And he understood this change did not come from regret alone but from growth inspired by witnessing someone live authentically. Eleanor's influence remained present not through contact but through memory, shaping his choices. Quietly, he no longer imagined winning her back or rewriting history, because he finally understood that love is not ownership and timing matters as much as feeling. Instead, he carried gratitude for what their relationship taught him even after it ended. Late one evening while walking home through the city, Daniel passed a bookstore window displaying magazines and again saw Eleanor's photograph among headlines celebrating leadership and innovation. Yet this time the sight did not tighten his chest, it brought calm acceptance. He paused briefly, smiling faintly, recognizing that her success no longer represented something he lost but something he was fortunate to have witnessed during its earliest chapter. He realized that people enter our lives not always to stay but to reveal parts of ourselves we might never discover alone. And as he continued walking beneath streetlights glowing against the night sky, he felt lighter than he had in years, because understanding replaced regret, respect replaced longing, and the story that once felt defined by separation had evolved into quiet appreciation. Eleanor moved forward building a future aligned with her values while Daniel moved forward carrying lessons that reshaped his own path. Two lives no longer connected by marriage yet forever linked by growth, proving that sometimes the true ending of a relationship is not heartbreak but transformation. And in that realization, Daniel finally found peace with the past and clarity for the life still waiting ahead. Autumn arrived quietly in the city, bringing cooler mornings and longer shadows across the sidewalks, and Daniel noticed how the changing season mirrored the steady shift happening within him. Life no longer felt like a race toward validation but a series of deliberate choices shaped by reflection. He began declining invitations that once seemed important simply because they were visible, choosing instead smaller gatherings, conversations that carried sincerity rather than performance. And colleagues remarked that he seemed calmer, more grounded, though he never explained why, because some lessons cannot be taught through words, they must be lived. One Saturday morning he walked through Central Park just after sunrise, the air crisp enough to see faint breath with each exhale, runners passing quietly while leaves scattered across the path in shades of gold and amber, and he remembered how Eleanor loved early walks like this, saying nature reminded her that growth happens slowly. And without announcement at the time he dismissed those thoughts as sentimental, yet now he understood their meaning. Progress does not always demand recognition, sometimes it simply unfolds. Daniel paused near a bench overlooking the lake, watching sunlight stretch across the water, and realized he no longer replayed their separation with regret alone. Instead he examined his own role honestly, recognizing how ambition once blinded him to emotional presence, how he measured value through achievement instead of character, and acknowledging these truths brought unexpected relief, because self-awareness replaced defensiveness. Weeks later an article appeared announcing a new national initiative led by the Heiress Foundation focused on expanding educational access across rural communities. Daniel read every detail carefully, noting Eleanor's emphasis on opportunity rather than charity, empowerment rather than image, and he smiled slightly at the familiarity of her philosophy. She had always believed real change required patience. He began volunteering time mentoring young professionals within his company, offering guidance without expecting recognition, discovering fulfillment in helping others navigate challenges he once faced alone. And through these quiet acts he felt a sense of alignment he had never experienced during his earlier pursuit of success. One evening while leaving the office he received an email invitation to a public lecture hosted by the foundation. Eleanor scheduled to speak about leadership and resilience. He hesitated before attending, unsure whether his presence would feel intrusive, yet curiosity and respect guided him there. The auditorium filled gradually with students, entrepreneurs, and community leaders, and when Eleanor stepped onto the stage the room settled instantly, her voice calm, thoughtful, Speaking not about wealth but about responsibility, she described how setbacks often reveal who we truly are and how growth begins when we stop seeking approval and start honoring our own values. Daniel listened closely, recognizing pieces of their shared history woven subtly into her message without personal reference, and he felt gratitude rather than sadness, understanding that their past contributed to the wisdom she now shared. With thousands, after the lecture ended, he chose not to approach her, sensing that acknowledgement no longer required conversation. Instead he left quietly, stepping into the evening air feeling peaceful, because he realized closure is not a single moment but a gradual understanding that life continues beautifully even when paths diverge. Eleanor continued shaping a future defined by purpose while Daniel moved forward carrying lessons that reshaped his own identity. And as city lights flickered on around him, he recognized that growth does not erase love or loss. It transforms them into guidance, allowing both people to evolve without resentment, proving that sometimes the most meaningful connection between two people exists not in staying together but in the lasting change they inspire within each other long after the relationship ends. Winter settled over the city with quiet certainty, covering rooftops in pale frost and slowing the rhythm of daily life just enough for reflection to deepen, and Daniel noticed how differently he experienced the season compared to years before. There was no restless urgency pushing him forward anymore, only steady intention guiding each decision. He spent more evenings at home reading instead of attending crowded networking events, finding unexpected comfort in stillness, and sometimes he caught himself remembering small details about Eleanor not with longing but appreciation, the way she valued calm evenings, how she believed meaningful lives were built through consistency rather than constant motion. Lessons that once felt ordinary now revealed lasting wisdom. One evening as snow began falling lightly outside his apartment window, Daniel received a message from a former mutual acquaintance mentioning a nationwide scholarship program recently launched by the Hayes Foundation. Thousands of students receiving opportunities that would shape their futures for decades. And Daniel paused reading the announcement, recognizing the scale of impact Eleanor was creating, not through dramatic headlines but through sustained change that would outlive recognition. He felt genuine pride for her success, not as someone connected to her past but as a person who admired what she represented, growth achieved through patience and integrity. Weeks passed and Daniel continued building a life shaped by new awareness, mentoring younger colleagues, volunteering weekends teaching financial literacy workshops in community centers across the city, discovering fulfillment in contribution rather than competition, and he realized something important had shifted within him. He was no longer trying to become impressive, he was trying to become meaningful. One afternoon while walking through a quiet bookstore, he noticed a display featuring influential leaders shaping modern philanthropy. Eleanor's name among them again, yet this time the recognition felt peaceful. He no longer measured himself against her achievements. Instead he understood that their journeys were never meant to mirror each other. They were meant to evolve separately, shaped by different lessons learned at different times. Later that season, Daniel attended a public panel discussion about sustainable investment where Eleanor participated alongside several global leaders. He chose a seat near the back of the auditorium, content to listen without needing acknowledgement. And as she spoke about responsibility, resilience, and learning to trust one's own direction, he recognized the authenticity behind every word. She was not presenting success as triumph over others but as harmony with oneself. The audience listened attentively, inspired not by wealth but by clarity of purpose, and Daniel felt a quiet sense of closure deepen within him, understanding that their shared history had completed its role. After the event he left before the crowd gathered around her, stepping into the cold evening air feeling lighter than he had in years, because acceptance had replaced regret completely. He realized that love sometimes leaves behind its greatest gift not in reunion but in transformation. Eleanor continued forward building legacies that touched countless lives while Daniel continued forward guided by lessons born from reflection and humility. Two paths moving in parallel without intersecting again yet connected by the silent impact they had on each other's growth. And as snowflakes drifted slowly beneath the glow of streetlights, Daniel understood that the true measure of a relationship is not whether it lasts forever, but whether it helps each person become someone wiser, kinder, and more aligned with who they are meant to be. And in that realization he finally felt gratitude stronger than regret, knowing that some people enter our lives not to stay but to awaken the parts of us that only loss can reveal. Spring arrived gradually, melting the last traces of winter and filling the city with softer light that lingered longer each evening. and Daniel felt the change not only in the weather but within himself, as though a quiet chapter had finally closed and another had begun without announcement. Routines that once felt unfamiliar now defined his days with steady purpose. Early mornings spent reviewing mentorship plans, afternoons dedicated to meaningful work rather than constant advancement, evenings reserved for reflection instead of distraction, and he realized that fulfillment no longer depended on reaching the next milestone but on understanding why he pursued anything at all. One Saturday afternoon he attended a community event organized by young entrepreneurs he had been mentoring. Watching them present ideas with nervous excitement, reminding him of his own early ambition, yet this time he listened differently, encouraging patience, emphasizing integrity over speed, and he noticed how deeply satisfying it felt to help others grow without needing recognition for himself. Afterward, as he walked home beneath trees beginning to bloom, he understood that growth often reveals itself through how we treat others rather than how the world treats us. Eleanor's influence remained present not as memory alone but as a quiet standard guiding his decisions. He no longer wondered what might have happened if their marriage had survived because he finally accepted that both of them needed separate journeys to become who they were meant to be. Weeks later, news spread about an international expansion of the Hayes Foundation, partnerships forming across continents, initiatives supporting education, sustainability, and long-term economic stability, and Daniel read the announcement with genuine admiration, recognizing how consistent her vision had remained from the beginning. She had always believed in building something that outlasted personal recognition, and now the world simply caught up to her clarity. One evening while walking along the riverfront, he paused as the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, reflecting on how differently he experienced success now. Compared to years before, there was no urgency to prove anything, only gratitude for lessons learned through both love and loss. He realized that regret had transformed into respect, and respect had evolved into inspiration, because witnessing Eleanor's journey had forced him to confront his own assumptions about ambition, partnership, and personal worth. He understood now that relationships do not fail simply because people change. Sometimes they end because growth requires solitude before understanding can exist, and accepting this truth freed him from lingering questions. Later that month, Daniel received recognition within his company not for aggressive achievement but for leadership defined by mentorship and ethical decision-making, a moment that felt quietly meaningful rather than triumphant. And as applause filled the room, he realized he was no longer measuring success against anyone else's path. He was finally living according to values shaped by experience rather than expectation. That evening he walked home through streets alive with spring energy, couples laughing outside restaurants, music drifting from open windows, life continuing in countless directions at once, and he felt an unexpected sense of peace knowing that Eleanor was somewhere in the world continuing her work, building futures for people she might never meet. While he continued building a life grounded in awareness and authenticity, their stories no longer intertwined yet forever connected by transformation. And Daniel understood that sometimes the greatest closure is not reunion or reconciliation but the quiet recognition that both people became stronger because of what they once shared. And as the city lights turned on one by one, he smiled gently, carrying forward not regret but gratitude, knowing that the true legacy of their relationship was not what ended, but what it helped each of them become. Summer arrived with long golden evenings stretching across the city skyline, and Daniel noticed how naturally peace had become part of his daily life, no longer something he searched for but something that quietly accompanied him wherever he went. Mornings began with steady routines that felt intentional rather than automatic. Coffee brewed slowly while sunlight filled his apartment, workdays guided by purpose instead of pressure, and relationships around him felt deeper because he listened more than he spoke. Months had passed since he last saw Eleanor in person, yet her presence remained woven into the way he understood success, not as a destination but as alignment between values and actions. One afternoon his company invited him to represent their leadership team at a national conference focused on ethical investment and social responsibility, an event gathering industry leaders, innovators, and philanthropists from across the country. And when Daniel reviewed the speaker list, his eyes paused briefly at a familiar name scheduled for the closing keynote, Eleanor Hayes. He felt no shock this time, only calm curiosity, as if life were gently offering another moment of reflection rather than unfinished emotion. The conference took place in Chicago overlooking Lake Michigan, sunlight shimmering across the water as attendees filled the grand ballroom with quiet anticipation. Daniel listened to panel discussions throughout the day, noticing how conversations increasingly echoed ideas Eleanor had long embraced: sustainability, long-term thinking, responsibility toward communities, concepts once dismissed as idealistic now forming the foundation of modern leadership, and he recognized how ahead of her time she had always been. When evening arrived, the lights dimmed slightly and Eleanor stepped onto the stage to deliver the final address, her presence confident yet understated, speaking not about personal achievement but about the courage required to grow beyond old identities. She spoke about how life sometimes removes people or circumstances not as punishment but as invitation, encouraging individuals to discover who they are without external validation. Daniel listened carefully, sensing that her words were shaped by lived experience rather than theory. The audience responded with thoughtful silence followed by sustained applause, not the loud excitement of spectacle but the respectful acknowledgement of truth. After the session, guests gathered in clusters discussing ideas inspired by her speech, yet Daniel chose to remain seated for a moment longer, absorbing the realization that he no longer viewed her through the lens of loss. She had become a symbol of transformation rather than regret. Later in the evening their paths crossed briefly near the conference exit, recognition passing between them with easy familiarity. They exchanged warm greetings, speaking comfortably about work and shared memories without tension or longing. Eleanor expressed genuine happiness seeing how grounded he seemed, and Daniel thanked her quietly for lessons she never intended to teach yet changed his life profoundly. There was no unfinished emotion between them, only mutual respect shaped by time and growth. As they said goodbye once again, Daniel felt an unexpected sense of completion, understanding that closure does not erase the past, but allows it to exist peacefully within memory. Walking outside into the warm summer night, he watched the lights reflecting across the lake and realized that the journey which began with regret had led him toward clarity. Eleanor continued forward, building legacies that touched countless lives while he continued forward, living with deeper awareness and purpose. And in that moment Daniel understood that true success is not measured by what we keep, but by what we learn to appreciate even after it is no longer ours. And as he walked along the shoreline beneath the quiet glow of city lights, he felt grateful not for a second chance but for the wisdom gained from the one chance they once shared. Late summer faded into early autumn again, marking nearly a year since Daniel first saw Eleanor's face on that magazine cover, and he noticed how time had transformed what once felt like a moment of shock into a quiet turning point that divided his life into before and after understanding. His days now moved with calm consistency, work guided by principle rather than ambition alone, relationships built on presence rather than impression. And for the first time since his divorce he felt fully at home within his own life. One afternoon he received an unexpected invitation to speak at a leadership seminar for young professionals entering the finance industry, an opportunity he would once have treated as another achievement to display. Yet now he approached it differently, focusing not on accomplishments but lessons learned, and as he stood before the audience he spoke honestly about growth, about how success without awareness can lead people away from what truly matters, explaining that sometimes the most important turning points arrive disguised as endings. The room listened with thoughtful attention, and Daniel realized he was no longer speaking from theory but from lived experience shaped by reflection. After the seminar several attendees approached him sharing how his words resonated with their own uncertainties, and he felt a quiet fulfillment deeper than any promotion he had received in the past. Later that evening while walking through the city streets glowing under early fall lights, he reflected on how differently he now defined achievement. It was no longer measured by titles or recognition but by alignment between intention and action. Eleanor's influence remained present not as memory that held him back, but as inspiration that helped him move forward with clarity. He understood now that their separation had not been failure but transformation for both of them. Weeks later news announced that the Heiress Foundation had received international recognition for its long-term impact on education reform, and Daniel watched an interview where Eleanor spoke about leadership requiring humility, patience, and the willingness to grow beyond previous versions of oneself. Her words carried the same calm strength he remembered from years ago, and instead of wondering what might have been he felt gratitude for having known her before the world recognized her brilliance. One evening Daniel attended a small charity dinner organized by colleagues, an intimate gathering focused on community development rather than prestige, and during conversations he realized how naturally he now valued authenticity over appearance, listening more deeply, encouraging collaboration, and choosing sincerity even when it offered no immediate advantage. As the night ended he stepped outside into the crisp air, watching leaves drift across the sidewalk, and understood that the greatest change within him was invisible to others yet unmistakable to himself. He no longer lived in comparison to anyone else's journey. He lived with awareness shaped by lessons learned through love, loss, and growth. Eleanor continued traveling the world, expanding opportunities for countless individuals, while Daniel continued building a life rooted in purpose and compassion. And although their paths rarely crossed now, a quiet respect remained between them that required no contact to exist, because some connections evolve beyond presence into influence. And as Daniel walked home beneath the glow of streetlights, he recognized that closure is not a final conversation or dramatic moment, but the realization that both people moved forward stronger than they were before, carrying gratitude instead of regret, wisdom instead of longing, and peace instead of unfinished questions, understanding at last that sometimes the greatest victory is not winning someone back, but becoming someone better, because of the time you once shared. Winter arrived quietly, bringing with it a sense of reflection that felt different from years before, and Daniel noticed how the season no longer reminded him of absence but of progress. Mornings began with steady routines, coffee brewed slowly while sunlight stretched across his apartment windows overlooking the city, and he often found himself appreciating small moments that once passed unnoticed, a handwritten thank you note from a colleague, a conversation that lingered beyond business topics, or the simple comfort of knowing exactly who he was becoming. One afternoon he received a formal letter from the Hayes Foundation inviting him to attend an anniversary gala celebrating 5 years of global expansion. And although he hesitated briefly, he understood that accepting the invitation represented not reopening the past but honoring growth shared in different directions. The event took place in Chicago at a restored historic hall filled with warm lighting and quiet elegance. Guests from education, technology, and philanthropy gathered with a shared purpose rather than competition. And when Daniel entered the room, he felt calm instead of nervous anticipation. Eleanor stood near the stage speaking with several international partners, her presence confident yet approachable, reflecting years of dedication and experience. When their eyes met across the room, there was no surprise or discomfort, only recognition shaped by mutual respect. Later in the evening they spoke privately near a large window overlooking the city skyline, discussing projects, lessons learned, and how life had unfolded since their last meaningful conversation. Eleanor shared stories of schools built in underserved communities and young leaders empowered through mentorship programs, while Daniel spoke about guiding younger professionals to build careers rooted in integrity rather than comparison. Their conversation flowed naturally without expectation or unfinished emotion. Both understanding that what once connected them had evolved into something quieter, yet equally meaningful. Eleanor smiled and said that sometimes distance allows people to become the versions of themselves they were always meant to be, and Daniel agreed, realizing that neither of them needed to revisit the past because they had already carried its lessons forward. As the evening continued, they joined others celebrating achievements that extended far beyond individual success. Applause filled the hall when Eleanor received recognition for her foundation's impact, and Daniel watched with genuine pride, not as someone who had lost her but as someone grateful to have witnessed her journey from the beginning. Later they shared a final conversation before parting, promising nothing except continued respect and goodwill. Stepping outside into the cold night air, Daniel felt an unexpected sense of completion, not defined by reunion or separation but by acceptance. He understood that closure is not about returning to what once was but recognizing that two lives can move forward independently while still honoring the role they played in shaping one another. Weeks passed after the gala, and Daniel noticed how the experience strengthened his confidence in the life he had built. He invested more time mentoring young entrepreneurs, supporting community programs, and maintaining friendships grounded in authenticity. And one quiet Sunday afternoon he walked through a neighborhood park watching families gather, children laugh, and couples share peaceful conversations, realizing that happiness had become something steady rather than dramatic, something earned through patience and growth. Eleanor continued leading initiatives across continents while Daniel continued building a legacy defined by character and contribution. And although their paths would likely cross only occasionally in the future, the connection between them had transformed into mutual inspiration rather than longing. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the park, Daniel felt deeply certain that life rarely follows the story people imagine in youth. Yet sometimes the unexpected path leads to a more meaningful destination, one shaped by self-understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet realization that true success lies not in holding on to someone forever, but in becoming someone worthy of the lessons love once taught. Spring arrived with gentle warmth, and Daniel sensed that the rhythm of his life had settled into something enduring and calm. Mornings began earlier now as he developed a habit of walking 3 miles along the river before work, observing how the city awakened gradually with delivery trucks rolling down quiet streets and sunlight reflecting off glass buildings. These moments gave him clarity and reminded him how far he had come from the restless ambition that once defined his every decision. His mentoring program expanded beyond expectation as former interns returned to share their own successes, often crediting his guidance for helping them build confidence and ethical leadership. And Daniel realized that influence measured through people rather than profit carried deeper meaning. One afternoon he received an unexpected message from Eleanor sharing photos of a newly completed education center in Arizona, a project focused on providing digital learning opportunities for rural communities. Her note was simple and warm, expressing gratitude for conversations they had shared over the years that shaped her perspective on collaboration and resilience. Daniel responded with sincere congratulations, feeling no hesitation or emotional confusion, only appreciation for the continued exchange of encouragement between two individuals who had grown independently yet remained connected through shared values. Months passed and Daniel accepted an invitation to speak at a national leadership conference in Denver. Standing before an audience of professionals and students, he spoke about long-term fulfillment, emphasizing patience, integrity, and the courage to redefine success beyond external validation. He shared stories without naming specific people, describing how life sometimes redirects plans in ways that reveal deeper purpose, and the audience responded with thoughtful attention, rather than applause seeking inspiration. After the event, several young attendees approached him expressing relief at hearing a perspective that valued emotional maturity alongside ambition, reinforcing his belief that authenticity resonated more strongly than perfection. Later that evening, Daniel walked alone through downtown streets illuminated by soft evening lights, reflecting on how once he believed achievement would arrive as a dramatic milestone, yet instead it unfolded gradually through consistent choices and quiet personal growth. He thought about Eleanor not as a chapter closed but as a meaningful influence woven into his story, someone who helped him understand the balance between personal aspiration and emotional awareness. Summer approached, bringing invitations to collaborate with nonprofit organizations and educational institutions, and Daniel began dedicating 1 week each month to traveling and supporting community initiatives across different states, from small towns in Iowa to urban centers in California. Each experience deepened his understanding of how leadership could create opportunity without demanding recognition. During one visit to a community center, a young student asked him what success truly meant, and Daniel answered without hesitation that success is waking each day with clarity about who you are and how you can help others move forward, realizing as he spoke that he finally believed his own words completely. As autumn returned, Daniel stood once again near the river where his daily walks began months earlier, leaves drifting across the water while the air carried a familiar coolness, and he felt a quiet certainty that life had entered a new phase defined not by searching but by living with intention. He understood that relationships, achievements, and even unexpected endings all served as guides leading him towards self-understanding, and as the sun lowered behind the skyline casting long reflections across the water, Daniel smiled gently, aware that fulfillment was no longer something waiting ahead but something already present in the life he had consciously built, steady, meaningful, and open to whatever future chapters might arrive.